They thought nobody would notice at first. That's my guess. Otherwise, why choose such a remote stretch of grassland for their project? Probably they believed the wide-open acres, the vast, sun-baked horizon, the endless sway of native grasses and wildflowers gave them perfect cover for a quick, under-the-radar build. They guessed wrong. By the time I discovered those 40 condos rising like an alien fortress on my sacred prairie, the entire so-called community expansion was almost halfway done. From a distance, all you could see were weird silhouettes, rows of steel frames poking out of the tall grass, shimmering in the relentless midday heat. But as I got closer, the details emerged. Sprawling foundations, half-assembled balconies, trucks grinding down fresh dirt roads. It looked like a city of skeletons had sprouted overnight, right where my family's heritage and generations of rare wildlife had thrived in delicate balance. I must have pressed the brakes so hard that my tires squealed, stirring up clouds of dust on the gravel shoulder. My heart hammered, part rage, part disbelief. The heat beating down from the Arizona sun didn't help my spiraling emotions, but it was more than that. It was the shock of seeing what I'd never imagined possible. My quiet, protected land overrun with bulldozers, construction crews, and the bold letters on a sign that read, Arcadia Springs HOA. Future condos. Available soon. The sign practically sneered at me, as if this place had always been just an empty canvas for someone else's profit. But this land wasn't empty. It was alive, teeming with bobcats, hawks, and tall grasses that once supported entire ecosystems centuries before modern developments. I'm Mason Reed, a man known in certain circles as a stickler for environmental laws, a champion of land preservation and, though few people realize it on first glance, a renowned federal land inspector. My job is to enforce regulations that protect our country's natural heritage, from wetlands to prairies to ancient forests. Most folks see me as just another unassuming government type. They imagine me behind a desk, stamping documents. In reality, I've shut down entire corporate expansions, slapped million-dollar fines on reckless developers, and even triggered federal investigations that ended careers. But I rarely wave that around. Usually a quiet approach works better. At least, it does until some group thinks they can bulldoze over me and my land without consequences. Standing by my SUV on that scorching afternoon, I took in the extent of the damage. The land used to be a sweeping sea of grass, dotted with sagebrush, wildflowers, and the occasional mesquite. My grandfather had taught me how to identify the different grasses, blue stem, needle and thread, and switchgrass, explaining how each one played a role in the ecosystem. He called this place our Little Eden, a final remnant of the old frontier. When he passed, he left me not only memories but also this entire swath of land, on the condition I keep it wild. I'd done more than that. I'd secured official federal protections for it, ensuring that any attempt to develop would require an extensive review process. The problem was, apparently this HOA didn't bother with any of that. I found myself trudging through the dust toward a makeshift office trailer that stood near the center of the new construction. A swirl of emotion gripped my chest. Heartbreak for the habitat they'd destroyed, fury at the arrogance of whoever authorized this. My boots crunched over broken stalks of grass, and I noticed deep tire ruts scarring the ground. Over the roar of an excavator, I heard shouting. Workers coordinating tasks, maybe installing the next row of steel beams. It all felt like a punch to the gut. If only they'd known this land was not some forgotten wasteland but a protected haven. If only they realized that the man walking up in dusty jeans, sweat soaking through a simple collared shirt, had the power to shut down their entire operation. I yanked open the trailer door without knocking, stepping inside. The immediate blast of air conditioning made me blink. There, behind a flimsy desk piled with building plans, sat a woman in a tailored navy blazer. She glanced up, eyebrows arched. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as crisp as her outfit. In that moment, I sized her up. Mid-40s, hair neatly pinned, eyes reflecting that confident glint I'd seen in plenty of ambitious people. She had the air of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. I forced a tight smile. "Name's Mason Reed," I said. My voice sounded steady enough, though my anger simmered below the surface. I'm here about these condos. I'd like to see your permits, your environmental impact statements, all the paperwork that says you have any right to build in the middle of a federally protected prairie. Her eyebrow lifted higher, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Then she set her pen down. I'm Catherine Matthews, president of the Arcadia Springs HOA, she said, brushing imaginary dust off her blazer. We have every right to develop this area. Our association purchased the land from a private seller months ago. The county recognized it for residential expansion. I'm not sure what business it is of yours. My jaw tightened. Maybe you missed the part where this land is federally protected. There's no scenario where you can just erect 40 condos without extensive environmental reviews. Where are those reviews? I asked, voice edging with frustration. She blinked, lips pressing together. We have our own environmental consultant, she retorted, and they assured us the grassland was unremarkable. Not to mention the county commissioners assured us we only needed minimal paperwork. Our board greenlit the project. We broke ground. That's how it's done around here. She shrugged, as though building condos on a living ecosystem was no bigger deal than adding a new fence. I leaned forward on the desk, staring her down. Ms. Matthews, I said quietly, this land's protected status outranks any county note or internal board vote. You can't override federal designations, so you need to halt construction right now, or you face massive fines and possible demolition. She gave a short, scoffing laugh. You talk like you're some authority. Look, if you have an issue, take it up with our lawyers. My patience wore thin. Oh, I plan to, I spat. But understand this, you picked the wrong spot. And I'm not just some random local. I'm the federal land inspector assigned to this region. Your entire project is illegal, and I'm shutting it down. My voice rang sharp in the air-conditioned stillness. Her face froze, shock flickered in her eyes. Then she tried to mask it, forcing a tight grin. We'll see about that, she said calmly, though her knuckles had gone white around her pen. Perhaps you should show me your credentials if you're making such claims. I pulled out my official ID, letting it speak for itself. She stared at it for a moment, color draining from her cheeks. All right then, she managed, swallowing. I'll call our attorneys, we'll see who has the final say. Her bravado wasn't entirely gone, but cracks were showing. I could sense the fear creeping in. Good. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the trailer, ignoring the stares of several workers outside. My pulse hammered with adrenaline. I'd confronted hundreds of questionable developers over the years, but never had I seen such blatant disregard for a protected habitat. Usually, they tried to grease the right palms behind closed doors. This was far more brazen. Yet I had to be systematic, gather evidence, file immediate cease and desist orders, escalate as needed. My official powers included coordinating with the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and local agencies. If Miss Matthews thought she could brush me off, she'd learn quickly how wrong she was. That same day, I returned to my field office in the next town over, swiftly drafting a compliance order referencing the specific Prairie Preservation Act sections. My assistant, Jana, helped me compile photos from the site, along with maps showing the designated boundaries. She whistled low when she saw how big the condo project was. 40 units? They must be out of their minds. This is one of the last strongholds for certain rare grass species. You sure we can stop them in time? She asked, worry flickering in her eyes. I nodded. We have to. Let's get the docs together, notify the county, and push for an immediate injunction. They won't get away with this. Over the following days, I discovered the HOA had cunningly rushed their build by claiming local zoning permission, telling contractors they had only minimal environmental constraints. Meanwhile, Ms. Matthews publicly insisted her association had done everything by the book, labeling me an overzealous bureaucrat. She seemed to expect that if they finished enough of the condos, I'd be forced to let them stay. But I knew better. If we proved they built illegally, those condos could be bulldozed at the developer's expense, even if half the units were sold. I'd seen it happen in other states. I vowed that if they defied the law, they'd watch their shiny villas come crashing down. Then came the first blow from my side, a formal cease and desist order taped to the site's entrance. The letter spelled out that under federal code, all development on a recognized protected prairie must halt until a thorough review was completed. Failure to comply would trigger daily fines with possible criminal charges for repeated violations. The following morning, I drove by to see if they'd complied. My heart sank when I found the site as busy as ever. Workers crawling over half-finished balconies, an excavator rumbling in the background. They'd ripped the order off the fence, ignoring it entirely. Rage fueled my next move. I called an old colleague at the EPA, a no-nonsense enforcer named Terrence, who had a reputation for shutting down polluters. "Terry," I said, voice shaking with anger, "I've got a blatant violation. We might need federal intervention." Terrence listened, then told me to send him everything. "If they're messing with protected land," he growled, "we'll hit them with every statute in the book." Meanwhile, I prepared a lawsuit referral for the Department of Justice, because clearly this HOA had no fear of local or state warnings. They were about to discover how huge a mistake that was. But Ms. Matthews wasn't backing down. She hosted a press conference at the edge of the development, an event I watched from the sidelines. She stood in front of an elegant sign that read Arcadia Springs, Redefining Luxury, sporting her usual blazer and confident stance. Reporters hovered, cameras flashing, while she insisted they were creating needed housing and that bureaucratic red tape threatened to sabotage the dreams of families. She invoked terms like progress, community, and revitalization, painting me as some radical who hated development. My blood simmered, though I knew better than to storm in. Let her spin her narrative. Facts were on my side. But one moment near the end of her speech nearly made me snap. A reporter asked, "What about the environmental significance of this prairie?" Ms. Matthews smirked. "There's nothing special about a patch of dead grass," she said dismissively. "We have an expert's sign-off stating the ecosystem has no unique value." I clenched my fists in my jacket pockets. The sheer ignorance was galling. That dead grass contained seeds and species found in fewer than 10 places across the region. Her arrogance was staggering. Still, I forced myself to remain calm. The more she undermined the truth, the harder the public backlash would be once we exposed her lies. By day's end, the local news had Miss Matthews' quotes plastered on social media, sparking outrage among environmental groups. Messages poured into my office from activists volunteering to protest on site. My staff had to remind them to keep it legal. No trespassing, no vandalism. Meanwhile, Miss Matthews and her HOA board hammered on, apparently hiring extra crews to speed up construction. They were betting they could finish the condos before the courts intervened. But the court date for our injunction approached fast. I had every intention of locking them down legally before the month was out. The morning of the injunction hearing arrived with tension crackling in the air. In the hallway outside the courthouse, Ms. Matthews and her entourage of lawyers exuded confidence. She shot me a frosty look as we passed. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, heard both sides. My counsel detailed the official protected status of the land, the disregard for all regulations, the ongoing harm to flora and fauna. Ms. Matthews' lawyers tried to spin it as a minor dispute, claiming we overstated the ecological importance, but our evidence was overwhelming. The judge was unimpressed with their arguments. By noon, she granted the injunction, ordering immediate cessation of all building activities until further review. Ms. Matthews gritted her teeth, but nodded when the judge asked if she understood. I left feeling victorious, certain they'd have to comply now. Except they didn't. That same evening, my phone rang with an urgent call from one of my field inspectors. "They're still at it," he said, breathless. "I see trucks hauling lumber, people working under floodlights, ignoring the order." My heart pounded with fury. The next morning, I led a team back to the site, brandishing copies of the judge's ruling. We found the gates locked, a private security guard telling us no entry, HOA property. My staff exchanged stunned glances. This was contempt, plain and simple. The guard refused to open up, so we took photos through the chain link fence. Workers scurried around, building walls and roofing. The roar of saws and hammers filled the air. My staff recorded it all, capturing undeniable proof they were violating a court order. That evidence triggered the judge's wrath. Within days, Ms. Matthews was summoned back to court for contempt proceedings. She arrived looking less polished, eyes betraying stress. The hearing was intense. Our side showed the photos, the timestamps. The judge's face hardened. She threatened significant daily fines plus potential arrests if the HOA kept defying the law. Ms. Matthews' attorney tried to stammer about unavoidable delays, but the judge cut him off. One more infraction, she warned, and the county sheriff's department will forcibly shut down this site. Understood? Ms. Matthews nodded mutely. I left the courthouse feeling relief, though my anger lingered. This was an absurd game of cat and mouse, a high-stakes face-off that Ms. Matthews refused to end gracefully. Still, I hoped the steep fines and threat of arrest would finally force her hand. Sure enough, for the next week the site appeared quiet. My inspectors drove by daily. No new walls rose, no trucks delivered supplies. I thought maybe we'd broken their defiance at last. Then came the twist. Late on a Monday evening, I was finishing up some paperwork when the phone rang. A local police sergeant said there'd been an incident at the site. Someone had found new construction going on after hours, plus some kind of confrontation. My heart sank. I got the details. An activist group had confronted the workers, shouting about illegal building. Security guards threatened them. The police were called. By the time officers arrived, the workers had vanished, leaving half-installed framing behind. Miss Matthews was nowhere to be found. The entire situation reeked of desperation. Despite looming fines, the HOA apparently tried to stealthily continue building once more. Next morning, I marched straight to the county commissioners, demanding immediate action. I recommended we petition for a complete demolition order, seizing the property under eminent domain if necessary. The commissioners looked uneasy. "That's a nuclear option," one said, fiddling with his pen. Another nodded. "We understand your frustration, but are we sure we want to condemn the entire site? That's going to spark a massive legal fight." I exhaled. They're repeatedly violating a court order, ignoring fines, and continuing environmental damage on federally protected land. Our hands are tied if we don't escalate. We can't let them finish. The commissioners agreed to hold an emergency vote that afternoon. By then, word had spread widely. The local media hammered Ms. Matthews, portraying her as a villain, bulldozing nature. Environmental activists picketed outside the HOA's main office, chanting, "Save the Prairie." Photos of the half-finished condos dotted social media, some calling it the Towers of Shame. My phone buzzed endlessly with calls from other agencies offering support. Terrence from the EPA also arrived on the scene, looking grim. "This is worse than we expected," he said, stepping over piles of discarded lumber. "We might have to push for federal criminal charges if they keep ignoring orders." When the commissioners convened, the public turnout was huge. Residents, activists, even some from Ms. Matthews' HOA who opposed her recklessness. Ms. Matthews herself arrived late, flanked by lawyers. She seemed more rattled than usual, makeup failing to hide the strain. People glared at her, some booing softly. The commissioners heard testimonies from me, from a local ecologist, from furious neighbors who said the environment was being destroyed. Then Ms. Matthews' side tried to spin it again, claiming unfortunate misunderstandings. The commissioners weren't buying it. With a unanimous vote, they authorized a forced demolition if the HOA didn't comply within 48 hours. A hush fell over the chamber as the decision landed. Miss Matthews stood, trembling with anger, and left without a word. I felt the tension ease slightly, though I knew it was about to get messier. My staff prepared the logistics for a potential teardown. The sheriff's department arranged to stand by if the HOA resisted. I called the demolition contractors that same evening to put them on standby. This was the line in the sand. Ms. Matthews had a final chance to remove the structures voluntarily. If she refused, we'd do it by force. 48 hours came and went with no sign of compliance. The site still locked up, silent, though partial activity was rumored at night. The fines soared daily, but the HOA seemed to vanish into denial. So, with the commissioner's order in hand, I coordinated a convoy of county vehicles, a demolition crew, and sheriff's deputies. We arrived at dawn. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the battered grassland. My heart felt heavy. None of this was a joyous occasion, but justice needed to be served. We lined up outside the chain-link fence. The gate was locked, the sign reading private property, no trespassing. The deputies cut the lock, swinging the gate wide. We advanced carefully, trucks rumbling forward. Then Ms. Matthews and a handful of loyal supporters emerged from behind a half-finished condo. She rushed toward us, frantic. "You can't do this!" she screamed, blocking the path. The deputies politely but firmly moved her aside, repeating the court's orders. She spat curses, tears in her eyes. "You're all insane! You're destroying everything we worked for!" she shouted at me. I paused, meeting her gaze, feeling a twinge of pity. "You did this to yourself," I said quietly. "All you had to do was obey the law. You chose not to." Her face contorted with rage and sorrow, but she couldn't stop the inevitable. The demolition crew began their work, bulldozers roaring to life. The scene that unfolded next was both dramatic and heartbreaking. The giant machines pushed over steel beams, ripped apart incomplete walls, sending plumes of dust into the air. The half-constructed balconies collapsed in showers of debris. The grassland shook under the weight of unstoppable mechanical force. But I also knew that at least with the structures gone, we could begin to restore the land. Ms. Matthews sank to her knees at one point, sobbing as the villas crumbled. Some of her supporters yelled in protest, but the deputies held them back. On the other side, a small group of environmentalists watched quietly, relief mingling with sadness. This had all gone so far that total demolition was the only path left. By midday, half the structures lay in ruin, twisted metal and shattered concrete piled high. It would take days to fully clear the debris, but the message was clear. This was the end of the HOA's ill-conceived expansion. Ms. Matthews finally walked away, shoulders slumped, the fight in her eyes extinguished. I felt no triumph, just a somber satisfaction that the law had prevailed, and the prairie might one day heal. Over the ensuing weeks, the site was cleared completely. The county set up a replanting program distributing native seeds to help the land recover. Federal environmental experts arrived to assess damage and hopefully chart a path to partial restoration. Ms. Matthews faced massive personal liability for ignoring the injunction, while the HOA teetered on the verge of bankruptcy from fines and lawsuits by enraged investors. The local news crowned me some kind of environmental hero, which I shrugged off. My job was never about personal glory, just about protecting what's precious. In a final twist, investigators discovered that Ms. Matthews had bribed a county official to secure a rubber-stamped zoning approval. Indictments followed. The official resigned, the scandal rocking local politics. People whispered that Ms. Matthews had once been unstoppable, a charismatic force, but she found out the hard way that, unstoppable or not, no one outruns federal law on protected land. As for me, I quietly continued my job, ensuring the fractured soil got a second chance at life. Sometimes, near dusk, I'd drive out to the prairie's edge and stand where the condos once loomed. Now it's just open space again, the horizon unbroken except for a few mounds of grass. Coyotes roam at twilight? A hawk might screech overhead. If you didn't know the fiasco that occurred, you might think the land was never disturbed, though it'll take years before the deeper scars vanish. But nature is resilient. It recovers if we give it room. People occasionally ask me if the confrontation with the Arcata Springs HOA changed me. Maybe a little. It reminded me how greed and arrogance can trample entire ecosystems in the blink of an eye, but it also reaffirmed my faith in the law, that we have the tools to defend these places if we have the will. Ms. Matthews discovered too late that her association, flush with developer money, was no match for the fierce protective measures around a sacred prairie and for the unwavering resolve of a renowned federal land inspector who dedicated his life to safeguarding lands just like this one. In the end, the outcome was inevitable from the moment they broke ground. They picked the wrong spot. They challenged not only a quiet grassland but also the entire framework of environmental protections. They bet on their ability to outmaneuver red tape, never suspecting that red tape had teeth, never suspecting that the unassuming guy rolling up in dusty jeans had the power to unleash the full force of the federal government. So yes, I let them spin their illusions for a bit. I let them think they could brush me off. And then I made sure they learned the harsh truth. You can build 40 condos on my sacred prairie only if you're ready to see them torn down again, and face justice in front of the whole county when your illegal scheme collapses. Those final hours of demolition remain etched in my memory. The roar of bulldozers, the swirl of dust, the sense of finality as the last building frame toppled. People who witnessed it might recall the drama, the heartbreak for some, the triumph for others. For me, it was simply justice done. A victory for the land and the wildlife that can't speak for themselves. And as the sun set over that battered but still living prairie, I drove off with quiet satisfaction, knowing that once again the law stood firm against greed. I'd protected what I was sworn to protect. And that is why I do what I do, day in and day out, no matter how big or bold the opposition might appear. Because when it comes to this sacred prairie, I am unstoppable. And they picked the wrong spot to test me.